Tabe. Bala kum no hi. Bala. Bala.
Bala Riri! Cusco! Cusco!
He understands you, Skipper. What does he say?
Telling us to get out.
Well, talk him out of it. Ask him what goes on.
Vani di humya. Malem ani humya vana.
Anasava Kong!
In a world overflowing with movies, we need a hero. Someone to separate the bad from the good.
Sounds like a job. Verbal dioramas. Watches all the movies from comedy to drama. From the top roll sound. And don't forget the action. She'll watch until the end and then she'll give you her reaction. Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequels, sequels, remakes, and trivia and outtake. Movies you know, movies you don't. Interesting stories, all the categories.
Hi everyone, I'm Emma and welcome to the 9th Wonder of the World, Verbal Diorama, episode 347, King Kong. This is the podcast that's all about the history and legacy of movies you know and movies you don't, a show to gratify your curiosity. Welcome to Verbal Diorama, whether you're a brand new listener, whether you're a regular returning listener, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for choosing to listen to this podcast. I'm so happy to have you here for the history and legacy of King Kong. And obviously, if you are a regular returning listener, thank you for continuing to come back and listen to this podcast and support this podcast over the last 7 years. And now 347 episodes. I am so close to episode 350. Huge thank you to you for your support. It genuinely means so much to an indie podcaster who has done literally 347 episodes of this podcast by herself. So once again, thank you so much, regular returning listeners. And if you are a brand new listener, you have plenty to catch up on. It is now the month of June, and Kaijun has always been a popular month on this podcast. It's something that I really love to do. This is my 3rd time doing a Kaijun season, and I love great big hulking monster movies. I always have, I always will. The last episode was on the Meg, which is super cheesy, super fun, massive shark movie that I think is a lot of fun, and I have a lot of time for that movie. But when I was thinking about doing Kaijun, there were 2 movies in particular that I really wanted to go into. And this is the first of those 2 movies that I really, really wanted to do for this particular season, because it is time to bring out the big guns. And there's no movie bigger or indeed older on this podcast than the original King Kong from 1933. And this is going to be a huge episode. We have so much to go into. So without further ado, here is the very old radio trailer for King Kong. Be warned, there's a lot of screaming.
King Kong is coming, a monster, all-powerful, beating down all weapons, smashing all barriers. You won't believe your eyes. Here he comes. Listen. Rising out of the dense jungle, King Kong comes to claim his human sacrifice. The first white girl he has ever seen. She looks like a tiny doll in his huge, hairy claws he tramples toward his cave. Listen to her shrieks. Hear the din, the confusion of pursuit as they trail him into the depths of mystery. As they trail King Kong, the daring adventurers encounter a new menace, a prehistoric dinosaur. Listen to it crash like thunder through the jungle. It is almost upon them. It opens wide its hideous jaws. Their one hope is their gas bomb, for their bullets have had but little effect. It explodes. The brute stumbles, falls. Listen to its horrible defiance as it thrashes about in the agonies of death. Once again, death, looms before the gallant band. Out of the muddy waters of the swamp rises a huge lizard-like beast. It upsets their raft, tumbling them all into the water. They swim frantically for shore, but the monster scoops up several in its gaping mouth. Listen as the wilderness resounds with their cries for help. Trembles as King Kong clashes with another mighty monster in a savage struggle for supremacy. Great trees are broken like reeds. Even the ground gives way during this titanic combat. Bestial roars of rage and pain split the heavens. King Kong rips and tears and slashes at this new foe. With unbelievable strength, he finally crushes the life out of the one brute who dared defy him. King Kong is coming. The gigantic ape tears his enemy to pieces, and once more King Kong is triumphant. King Kong the Invincible. King Kong, monstrous monarch of the world. A great city shrieks in terror as King Kong runs amok, raging through the streets of New York like a tornado, hurling automobiles into the air, ripping streetcars from their rails, destroying buildings, everything in his path, as he hurls his defiance at humanity, at this new world of people that confused him. Roaring an ear-splitting challenge, King Kong makes his last stand against civilization atop the Empire State Building, snarling defiance and hatred of all mankind, clubbing with his great arms at the airplanes swarming about him like hornets. As the streams of machine gun bullets pour into his body, King Kong grabs one of the planes from the sky, crushes it like an eggshell, and hurls it down into Fifth Avenue far below. King Kong is coming. The picture that staggers the imagination.
In New York Harbour, filmmaker Carl Denham, known for wildlife films in remote exotic locations, is unable to secure an actress for a female role he's been reluctant to disclose. In the streets of New York City, he finds Anne Darrow and promises her the thrill of a lifetime, her being the leading lady in a picture they are to film on an uncharted island. On reaching the island, they find the native tribe preparing to sacrifice a young native woman. The native chief offers to trade 6 of his women for Anne, but the group refuses to give her over. That night, Anne is kidnapped by the natives, taken through the big gate and offered as a human sacrifice to a giant gorilla-like beast they call Kong. Let's run through the cast of this movie. We have Fay Wray as Anne Darrow, Robert Armstrong as Carl Denham, Bruce Cabot as Jack Driscoll, Frank Riker as Captain Engelhorn, Sam Hardy as Charles Weston, Victor Wong as Charlie, James Flavin as Briggs, and Noble Johnson as the native chief. King Kong has a screenplay by James A. Creelman and Ruth Rose, story by Edgar Wallace and Merian C. Cooper, and was directed by Merian C. Cooper and Ernest B. Schoedsack. The previous oldest movies featured on this podcast are Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs from 1937 and The Wizard of Oz from 1939. Remarkably, King Kong was made in 1933, over 90 years ago, and just like those two movies, remains ageless. And although King Kong is being included in kaiju, technically it's not a kaiju movie. The definition of kaiju broadly refers to the genre of giant destructive monsters and tends to have metaphorical meanings representing things like forces of nature and nuclear warfare. But that doesn't mean King Kong isn't a kaiju movie in the modern sense, nor does it mean it has no links to the OG kaiju. Kaiju as a genre is generally traced back to Godzilla in 1954, which was itself directly inspired by the beast from 20,000 Fathoms. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms featured special effects from Ray Harryhausen, who was Willis H. O'Brien, King Kong's visual effects supervisor's own protege. O'Brien worked on the 1925 movie The Lost World, which directly inspired King Kong. So the tree goes from O'Brien to The Lost World, to King Kong, to Harryhausen, to The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, to Godzilla, which then birthed the entire kaiju genre. King Kong was invented by Merian C. Cooper, a globe-trotting adventurer who was also a war hero. He'd been shot down multiple times in both World War I and the Polish-Russo War and escaped from a prisoner of war camp. The story was conceived partly through his trips to Africa and Southeast Asia to shoot documentary films with Ernest B. Schoedsack, which planted the idea of setting a primitive giant ape against the civilization of modern New York City. Cooper's friend Douglas Burden had travelled to the Indonesian island of Komodo and returned to New York with living specimens of Komodo dragons, putting them on display at the Bronx Zoo. Cooper was fascinated by the idea of explorers venturing to a remote island and coming back with a giant creature. His initial concept was a film about a gorilla fighting Komodo dragons. He chose gorillas over baboons because he felt gorillas had more personality, and crucially, gorillas at the time were almost mythical creatures to Western audiences, meaning Cooper could shape them into whatever he wanted them to be. Sadly, the Komodo dragons at the zoo died shortly after arrival, but this also directly shaped the story's ending, because when he was thinking about his gorilla picture, Cooper wanted to bring Kong back to New York in captivity, and because he was a little bit of a drama queen, rather than having the creature simply die in a zoo, he wanted it to escape and cause havoc. Komodos also inspired Kong's name. Cooper was fond of words that started with the letter K. Maybe he was the original Kardashian. And following Burden's trip to Komodo, Cooper wanted to capture a real gorilla from the Congo, which doesn't start with K but has that same hard K start. Cooper was fascinated by Burden's adventures as chronicled in his book Dragon Lizards of Komodo, where he referred to the animal as the King of Komodo. It was this phrase, along with Komodo and Congo, and his overall love for hard-sounding K words, that gave him the idea to name the giant ape Kong. But this was all happening during the Great Depression, and Cooper needed a production studio to make his Kong film, but he knew it would likely come at great cost. In October 1931, David O. Selznick had been hired as head of production at RKO Pictures, but the studio was struggling financially. Selznick championed the unit production system, which gave the producers of individual movies much greater independence than they had under the prevailing central producer system. After achieving cost savings of 30 to 40%, Selznick then recruited behind-the-camera talent like George Cukor and asked Cooper to join RKO. And although he'd only produced 3 films in his career thus far, Cooper began working as an executive assistant and officially pitched the idea for King Kong in December 1931. Cooper's first move was to bring in Edgar Wallace, a hugely prolific and popular British crime and adventure writer, to draft the script. Wallace started work in December 1931, with Cooper telling him exactly what he wanted including. Wallace's draft contained several instances of attempted sexual assault and racial tensions between characters. That first draft was called The Beast. It was dated the 5th of January 1932 and was completed shortly before Wallace's unexpected death. He died just a month after finishing it. Some of his ideas did survive into the final film: Kong removing Anne's clothes from her body, the rough outline of the New York scenes, and a jungle chase sequence all trace back to Wallace's draft. James Ashmore Creelman was brought in next, and he found it difficult to meet Cooper's demands, feeling there were too many fantastical elements for the film to be believable. Though he incorporated Cooper's requests, the dialogue proved to be too extensive, and Cooper was unsatisfied with the work, feeling that Creelman's draft was slow-paced, weighted down with long scenes of exposition, and written on a scale that would be prohibitively expensive to film. Creelman produced 2 further drafts, titled The Eighth Wonder and Kong, dated March and June 1932 respectively, before he exited the process. After Creelman quit, Cooper struggled to find a replacement screenwriter. Ruth Rose had never written a screenplay before and happened to be Ernest Schoedsack's wife, but she ended up becoming the secret weapon of King Kong. She gave Kong the heart, but she also trimmed the fat. Rather than explaining how Kong would be transported to New York, she cut from the island to the theatre. She rewrote the majority of dialogue and gave the script something Creelman's version lacked, a human core. She incorporated autobiographical elements, with Cooper himself the basis of the character of Carl Denham, her husband in the tough but tender Jack Driscoll, and herself in struggling actress Anne Darrow. She also created the film's opening sequence, showing Denham meeting Anne on the streets of New York, and most importantly, she removed the extreme sexual and racial elements from Wallace's original draft, making Kong more innocent in his interactions with Anne. Edgar Wallace's initial draft had been called The Beast, but RKO executives were unimpressed with the title. David O. Selznick suggested Jungle Beast as the film's new title, but Cooper wanted to name the film after the main character. He liked the mystery word aspect of Kong's name and that the film should carry the name of a leading mysterious, romantic, savage creature of the story, such as with Dracula and Frankenstein. RKO sent a memo to Cooper suggesting the titles Kong, King of Beasts, Kong, the Jungle King, and Kong, the Jungle Beast, which combined his and Selznick's proposed titles. Cooper would eventually name the story simply Kong, while Ruth Rose was writing the final version of the screenplay. It was David O. Selznick who added the King to Kong's name in order to differentiate it from the one-word docudramas of the time. The old Arabian proverb, "And lo, the beast looked upon the face of beauty, and it stayed its hand from killing, and from that day it was as one dead," which opens the film, was actually written by Merian C. Cooper and isn't a real Arabian proverb. And King Kong didn't even have a completed script when it started filming, and when it came to putting a cast together during pre-production, it was a mix of known and up-and-coming names. RKO's original choice for the role of Anne Darrow was Jean Harlow, but because MGM put Harlow under exclusive contract during the pre-production phase, she became unavailable. Cooper then approached Fay Wray, one of the Wampus baby stars in 1926, a prolific actress since her teens and an established presence in horror. Cooper offered her the role of Anne and told Ray she would be playing opposite the tallest, darkest leading man in Hollywood. Let's be honest, he wasn't lying. Robert Armstrong was a Michigan-born veteran Broadway and silent film character actor. Bruce Cabot was already signed by executive producer David O. Selznick as a contract player within RKO. He was the least established of the 3 leads, which created an odd marketing situation, because although the film's romantic subplot belongs to Cabot and Ray, it was the established star Armstrong who was chosen for promotional material rather than the unknown Cabot. Interestingly, King Kong wasn't the only movie Fay Wray and Robert Armstrong were working on with Merian C. Cooper and Ernest B. Schoedsack. During the day, they would film King Kong, and then at night, they would shoot The Most Dangerous Game on the same jungle sets. Ray and Armstrong were essentially making 2 films at once on the same soundstage with the same directors, sleeping in between. The Most Dangerous Game actually ended up coming out in 1932, and Fay Wray ended up starring in a whopping 11 movies in 1933, so King Kong and 10 others. And there is a reason for her availability, which I'll come back to. This was also a rare movie in that the native islanders were played by actual black people rather than white actors in blackface, which was unfortunately something pretty common in the 1930s. One of the most notable black actors in the movie is Noble Johnson, who actually also appeared in the original Universal 1932 The Mummy. Johnson was a pioneer in the black community as well as the black acting community. He founded Lincoln Motion Picture Company in 1916, an African-American film company that produced movies called race films that were made for an African-American only audience at a time when black people couldn't go to American movie theatres and the mainstream film industry ignored films for black people. Johnson was president of the company for 4 years before his own acting career was taking off and he couldn't manage both. But his commitment to African-American filmmaking was extraordinary. He had 145 acting credits over a career that spanned from 1915 to 1950, playing mostly black roles but also Native American, Arab and Asian roles. Johnson would be one of the few cast members in this movie to return for the hastily made sequel Son of Kong. But let's be honest, the human actors weren't the stars here. The star of the movie is Kong himself, and he is just a marvellous creation. And for that, we have to get into the extraordinary work of Willis H. O'Brien, who has been mentioned on this podcast before because he was the mentor to one of the greatest animators of all time, the one and only Ray Harryhausen worked under O'Brien and learned the stop-motion craft from him. But that didn't happen on King Kong. Harryhausen's tutelage occurred on Mighty Joe Young in 1949. O'Brien had worked on the visual effects on Harry O. Hoyt's The Lost World from 1925, and for much of his feature career he worked with Richard and Marcel Delgado to create detailed stop-motion models that were all based on O'Brien's designs, with rubber skin built up over complex articulated metal armatures. The models contained a bladder inside the skeleton model that could be inflated and deflated to give the illusion of breathing. By 1931, O'Brien had worked with Hoyt on a series of cancelled projects, including Atlantis for First National Studio, Frankenstein and Creation for RKO Pictures. Creation's cancellation in 1931 would be the catalyst for his work on King Kong. He'd only completed 20 minutes of effects footage to show for an estimated $120,000 development cost. And the studio's head of production, which was Merian C. Cooper, recommended the cancellation of O'Brien's project because he thought the story was boring, but he was impressed by the effects work, and he also wanted it for his giant gorilla movie, which is one way to get your own way. Cancel one movie so the guy can work on the one you want. O'Brien and the dinosaur models he'd created for the cancelled project were put to work on King Kong instead, and O'Brien set to work building the legendary ape. Cooper insisted that Kong couldn't be portrayed as an actor in a suit. For Kong's physical proportions, O'Brien consulted zoologists at the American Museum of Natural History to get exact measurements for a bull gorilla. The island's jungle environments were meticulously constructed miniature sets, with plants drawn from known jungle settings, created by layering glass paintings which were created by Mario Larinaga and Byron L. Crabb. The physical Kong puppet was a marvel of miniature engineering. While Merian C. Cooper envisioned Kong as being 40 to 50 feet tall, Willis O'Brien and his crew built the models and sets, scaling Kong to be only 18 feet tall on Skull Island and rescaled to be 24 foot tall in New York, although in some scenes he was rescaled to be as large as 60 feet tall. The puppet was made with cotton and latex, covered with rabbit fur, over a precisely machined ball and socket metal armature, a more sophisticated internal skeleton than had ever been used before. 4 stop-motion models were built in total, 3 from aluminium, foam rubber, latex and rabbit fur, and a simpler lead and fur model used specifically for the famous Empire State Building fall. For close-up shots, the team also built giant full-scale arms, hands and feet, while a giant 40-foot mechanised model head used cables and levers to simulate facial expressions and could carry humans in its mouth. RKO's promotional material listed Kong's official height as 50 foot. The soft fur on the puppet retained indents and movements from the animator's fingers between frames, which actually makes Kong feel more real. But it wasn't just Kong, but a whole host of prehistoric creatures inhabiting Skull Island, or Skull Mountain as it's known in this movie, and these were brought to life by O'Brien and his assistant animators, E.B. Buzz Gibson, Carol Shepard, Marcel Delgado, Orville Goldner and Fred Reef. Many of these creatures were the ones previously created for creation. And many of the techniques used in making King Kong were either completely revolutionary or they were making it up as they went along. The stop-motion animation was generally filmed first, with the live-action footage matched to it afterwards. Fay Wray actually ended up spending 22 hours positioned in a fake tree, reacting to a battle scene projected onto a translucent screen behind her while the camera filmed her reaction. An immersive setup that allowed her to convincingly portray her character's observation of the animated battle. But the process could also run in reverse, and the actors would be shot first, with the animation then created to match their movements and reactions. To achieve that, O'Brien created the miniature rear projection camera in 1933, which allowed him to project a part of the shot as a miniature, frame by frame, then proceed making the stop motion according to what was happening in the miniature. Rear projection was the backbone of most of the human-Kong interaction. King Kong is often credited as the first film to use miniature rear projections to create special effects sequences. For more complex shots where live actors had to appear within the same frame as Kong, they used the Dunning process, invented by cinematographer Carroll H. Dunning, which used blue and yellow lights filtered and photographed into black and white film, bypacking the camera to combine two strips of film simultaneously, creating the final composite shot in camera. It was used in scenes like the climactic moment where the plane crashes from the top of the Empire State Building and where natives run through the foreground while Kong battles others at the wall. For wider shots, they used the Williams process, invented by cinematographer Frank D. Williams. It didn't require coloured lights and used an optical printer to synchronise a projector with a camera, so several strips of film could be combined into a single composited image. It was used in the scene where Kong shakes the sailors off the log and where Kong pushes the gates open. The optical printer would continue to be used in film until the late 1980s, when it was superseded by digital compositing. Animation for the movie was completed after 55 weeks, and the actors filmed on several stages over an 8-month period. Some actors had so much time between filming King Kong that they were able to fully complete work on other films, and this is how Fay Wray has so many film credits in 1933. Her physical experience of making King Kong was, by her own account in her autobiography, gruelling. Not only was she almost constantly screaming, she is the original Scream Queen, she also had to balance herself in Kong's 6-foot-long giant mechanical hand, attached to a lever which could be raised or lowered, with wind machines giving motion to her clothes. Fay Wray really went through it on this movie, and I think her performance really does genuinely convey the fear that she is feeling at the time. Because at any moment she could have fell off that hand. They didn't really have health and safety in the 1930s. Fay Wray would also then repeat all of her screams in a sound studio. The stop motion work in particular was punishing. Most sequences had to be shot non-stop, often requiring 20-hour workdays. Sometimes the shrubs used to dress the miniature sets wilted during filming, but similarly at one point one of the plants flowered, which left a day's worth of animation rendered useless. Before a scene could be started, all the lights on the soundstage had to be replaced with new ones to ensure they wouldn't flicker, and the stage had to be sealed so nobody could enter or leave to prevent any wind from moving the foliage. King Kong finished filming in February 1933, and it was filmed on location at San Pedro Harbor, California, the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles for the Kong on stage scenes, and the backlot at Culver Studios where the jungle and Great Wall sets were built, as well as miniatures of the ship and a ship set. Before the film's release, Cooper hired Delos W. Lovelace to write a novel version of King Kong. The film's novelisation, which was published prior to its release, entered the public domain through a failure to include a copyright notice, making the characters and story public domain. This is important because the rights to King Kong are messier than the jungle after Kong's dinosaur killing spree. When Merian C. Cooper created King Kong, he assumed he owned the character outright, maintaining that he'd only licensed it to RKO for the initial film and the sequel, but that assumption turned out to be a little bit disputed, shall we say. In 1962, Cooper found out that RKO was licensing the character through John Beck to Toho Studios in Japan for a film project called King Kong vs. Godzilla. Cooper had assumed his rights were unassailable and was bitterly opposed to the project, including the fact their Kong would be a man in a suit, something that he was vehemently against. In 1963, he filed a lawsuit against John Beck, Toho and Universal, the film's US copyright holder. But the lawsuit never went through because, as it turned out, he was not Kong's sole legal owner as he had believed himself to be. A crucial turning point came around the time of the 1976 remake, when it was time to sort out who owned what. RKO, Universal and Cooper's son were all met with the court's decision that King Kong was in the public domain because Cooper had failed to renew the copyright on the 1933 film's novelisation. In a 4-day bench trial in Los Angeles, Judge Manuel Real gave his verdict on the 24th of November 1976, affirming that the King Kong novelisation and serialisation were indeed in the public domain, and that Universal could make its own film as long as it did not infringe on original elements in the 1933 RKO film, which at that point had not yet passed into the public domain. This ruling became known as the Cooper judgment, and it meant the basic story, the character concept, and the name King Kong from the novelisation could be freely used by anyone. RKO Pictures still owns the rights to the 1933 film and its sequel Son of Kong, also in 1933. However, domestic distribution rights to those films are owned by Warner Media. Studio Canal owns the 1976 King Kong film and its 1986 sequel, having absorbed the De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, with Paramount Pictures holding domestic distribution rights to that variant. The Merian C. Cooper estate claims ownership over the original book and publishing rights for the character. But on the 1st of January 2029, the 1933 film will enter the public domain, at which point anything Kong-related, as depicted in the 1933 RKO version of King Kong, will be free for anyone to use. It's worth adding at this point that Warner Brothers' version of Kong within the Monsterverse, which is Kong Skull Island and any of the Godzilla vs. Kong movies, won't be affected because these more recent films retain their own separate copyrights. But speaking of lawsuits, in 1982, Universal filed a lawsuit against Nintendo, which had created Donkey Kong in 1981 and was reaping huge profits over video game machines. Universal claimed that Nintendo was infringing on its copyright because Donkey Kong, being a large gorilla, was a blatant rip-off of King Kong. Universal contacted Nintendo, giving them 48 hours to cease marketing Donkey Kong, to dispose of all Donkey Kong inventory, and to hand over all records of profits made from the game. Nintendo's attorney, Howard Lincoln, was at first inclined to settle for $5 to $7 million, but eventually he decided to fight because he realised that Donkey Kong was the sign that Nintendo had made it big. On the 3rd of January 1983, Universal then sent cease and desist letters to Nintendo's licensees offering 3 options: stop using Donkey Kong characters, obtain a licence from Universal, or be sued. Lincoln hired John Kirby to represent Nintendo in court. During the court battle and subsequent appeal, the courts ruled that Universal did not have exclusive trademark rights to the King Kong character. They ruled the trademark was not among the rights Cooper had sold to Universal. While they had a majority of the rights, they did not outright own the King Kong name and character. And the court's ruling noted that the name, title and character of Kong no longer signified a single source of origin, so exclusive trademark rights were impossible. The courts also pointed out that the Kong rights were held by three parties: RKO, who owned the rights to the original film and its sequel; the Dino De Laurentiis Company owned the rights to the 1976 remake; and Richard Cooper, the son of Merian C. Cooper, owned worldwide book and periodical publishing rights. The judge then ruled that Universal owned only those rights in the King Kong name and character that RKO, Cooper and the Dino De Laurentiis Company did not own. The Court of Appeals also noted that Universal knew that it did not have trademark rights to King Kong, yet proceeded to broadly assert their rights anyway, and this amounted to a wanton and reckless disregard of Nintendo's rights. Second, Universal didn't stop after it asserted its rights to Nintendo and embarked on a deliberate, systematic campaign to coerce all of Nintendo's third-party licensees to either stop marketing Donkey Kong or pay Universal royalties. Finally, Universal's conduct amounted to an abuse of judicial process and in that sense caused a longer harm to the public as a whole. Universal alternatively argued to the courts first that King Kong was part of the public domain, and then second that King Kong was not part of the public domain, and that Universal possessed exclusive trademark rights to it. Universal's assertions in court was based not on any good faith belief in their truth, but on the mistaken belief that it could use the courts to turn a profit. And because Universal misrepresented their degree of ownership of King Kong, claiming they had exclusive trademark rights when they knew they did not, and tried to have it both ways in court regarding the public domain claims, the courts ruled that Universal acted in bad faith. They were ordered to pay fines and all of Nintendo's legal costs from the lawsuit. That, along with the fact that the courts ruled that there was simply no likelihood of people confusing Donkey Kong with King Kong, caused Universal to lose the case and the subsequent appeal. And as for Nintendo's lawyer John Kirby, Nintendo considered him to have saved the entire company by defending them against the lawsuit from Universal. So much so, they named the video game character Kirby after him, as well as bought him a $30,000 boat, which was christened Donkey Kong. And now a word from our sponsors, which is you, if you'd like to be. Thank you for listening to this podcast. It's completely independent, made by me, and relies on listener support. If you're enjoying this episode and the work that I do, and you want to support an indie podcaster, if you have some spare change, you can financially contribute to the upkeep of this podcast. You're under no obligation. This podcast is free and always will be, but there are a couple of ways you can help if you wish to and if you have the means to. You can make a one-off donation at verbaldiorama.com/tips, or you can subscribe to the Patreon to support the show monthly at verbaldiorama.com/Patreon. All money made goes back into this podcast by paying for software subscriptions, website hosting, and new equipment. Huge thank you for your continued support. Now let's learn some more about this movie and how Keanu Reeves is somehow connected to it. It's time to segue into the obligatory Keanu reference of this episode, and if you don't know what that is where I try and link every movie that I feature with Keanu Reeves because he is the best of men. And I truly do not know how to link Keanu Reeves to King Kong. It's so very difficult when a movie came out in 1933, literally like almost 100 years ago. There is no physical way of me linking Keanu to this movie. However, I decided that I didn't want to let it beat me. So the easiest way to link Keanu Reeves to this movie is that King Kong is the king of his world and Keanu is the king of men. And it's goofy, but it's the only way that I can do it. But let's talk about the music, because the score for King Kong really did represent a shift in the scoring of movies in general and of the use of non-diegetic music in movies. RKO bosses were initially sceptical about the need for an original score. However, they agreed to let Merian C. Cooper try to improve the film with the use of music. The studio suggested using old tracks in order to save money, but Cooper asked regular RKO musical collaborator Max Steiner to score the film. And because the funding for the film had almost run out, He said he would personally pay for the orchestra. Steiner wrote the score in 2 weeks, and Cooper paid him $50,000. And King Kong became a landmark of film scoring, including the use of leitmotifs for Kong, Anne, and the jungle itself. Steiner would say that King Kong was made for music. King Kong's roar was actually a lion's roar and a tiger's roar, combined, slowed down, and ran backwards. Upon the release of the film, the score received very little critical review because it was mostly overshadowed by the special effects. However, it started to receive more attention as the movie became more famous in the years that followed. Composer Christopher Palmer wrote that the score marked the real beginnings of Hollywood music, and Professor of Music at the University of Nottingham Mervyn Cook added that it almost single-handedly marked the coming of age of non-diegetic film music. It was the first feature-length original score for a talkie, the first major Hollywood film to use an original thematic score rather than background music, the first score to use a 46-piece orchestra, and the first score to be recorded on 3 tracks, one for sound effects, one for dialogue, and one for music. King Kong is known as a pre-code adventure horror monster film, and to understand what that actually means and the implications it had on re-releases of the movie, we need to talk briefly about the Hays Code. In 1922, after some risque films and a series of scandals involving Hollywood stars, the studios enlisted Presbyterian elder Willis H. Hays to rehabilitate Hollywood's image, and the way he did that was the Hays Code, which was adopted in 1930, but oversight was poor and it wasn't rigorously enforced until the 1st of July 1934, so the year after King Kong, with the establishment of the Production Code Administration. This is why King Kong, released in March 1933, is classified as pre-code. The rules technically existed on paper, but no one was really enforcing them. What finally forced genuine enforcement in late 1933 and escalated throughout the first half of 1934 was American Catholics, who launched a campaign against what they deemed the immorality of American cinema, known as the Legion of Decency. This, along with a potential government takeover of film censorship, was enough pressure to force the studios to capitulate to greater oversight. The code prohibited profanity, suggestive nudity, graphic or realistic violence, sexual persuasions and rape. It had rules around the use of crime, costume, dance, religion, national sentiment and morality. More specifically, it forbade the use of profanity, obscenity and racial slurs, graphic violence, criminality, substance use, promiscuity, miscegenation and homosexuality. It was even why married couples were required to sleep in separate beds for at least 2 decades of Hollywood filmmaking. While the original release of King Kong in 1933 was pre-code, when it was reissued in 1938, the newly empowered Production Code Administration demanded that 29 scenes from the original version be cut before the film could be granted a seal of approval. These scenes include the scene where Kong holds an unconscious Anne captive while gently peeling off her dress. That was considered completely unacceptable and eliminated entirely. The Brontosaurus attack was edited so the creature claimed only 3 victims rather than 5, because apparently 3 deaths are more morally acceptable than 5 deaths. The scene where Kong bites off a woman's head and stomps a villager to the ground was removed, as was a scene where he grabs a woman from a hotel room and throws her to her death after realising she isn't Anne. The code remained in effect until 1968, when it was replaced by the MPAA film rating system, which is still in use today. RKO didn't preserve copies of the film's negative or release prints with the excised footage, and the cut scenes were considered lost for many years. In 1969, a 16mm print, including the censored footage, was found in Philadelphia. The cut scenes were added to the film, restoring it to its original theatrical running time of 100 minutes. Restoration teams then painstakingly reintegrated the moments that had disappeared across decades of reissues. An original release print located in the UK in the 1980s was found to contain the cut scenes in better quality. After a 6-year worldwide search for the best surviving materials, a further fully digital restoration using 4K resolution scanning was completed by Warner Brothers in 2005. King Kong's Hollywood premiere was held on the 24th of March 1933 in Grauman's Chinese Theatre and was officially released on the 7th of April 1933. Despite this movie coming out during the Great Depression, King Kong did extremely well financially. On its opening weekend, it earned $90,000, and during its first run in 1933, earned a profit of $650,000. In fact, the weekend after King Kong's 1933 release, newly elected President Franklin Roosevelt ordered a bank holiday to halt the panic in the financial sector. King Kong was then re-released in 1952 after Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs' own re-release was successful. Before the 1952 re-release, the film is reported to have worldwide rentals of $2,847,000, including $1,070,000 from the United States and Canada, and profits of $1,310,000. Profits from the re-release were estimated by the studio to be about $2.5 million, which was about double what the film earned in 1933. Now, I'm reliably told that Rotten Tomatoes didn't exist in 1933, but I'm also told that on its release, it received generally positive reviews, and contemporary reviews on Rotten Tomatoes are overwhelmingly positive, with a 97% rating and the site's critical consensus reading, King Kong explores the soul of a monster, making audiences scream and cry throughout the film, in large part due to Kong's breakthrough special effects. So much so, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, also called the Academy, wanted to give Willis H. O'Brien an Oscar for his technical effects on King Kong. But Willis insisted that each of his crew also receive an Oscar, which the Academy refused to do, so O'Brien refused to accept the Oscar award for himself. He would finally win his Academy Award 17 years later for Mighty Joe Young in 1949, the film on which he trained a young Ray Harryhausen. The same year of King Kong's release, a sequel was fast-tracked and released as well. That was called Son of Kong. That came out in December 1933, so literally 9 months later, they made a sequel. In the 1960s, RKO licensed the King Kong character to Japanese studio Toho, which made 2 films, King Kong vs. Godzilla, the third film in Toho's long-running Godzilla series, and King Kong Escapes. In 1976, producer Dino De Laurentiis released a modern remake of King Kong, followed by a 1986 sequel called King Kong Lives. In 1998, a loosely adapted direct-to-video animated version, The Mighty Kong, was distributed by Warner Brothers. In 2005, Universal Pictures released another remake of King Kong, co-written and directed by Peter Jackson, which is set in the 1930s, as in the original film. Legendary Pictures and Warner Brothers made Kong Skull Island in 2017, which serves as part of a cinematic universe called the Monsterverse, followed by the sequels Godzilla vs. Kong in 2021 and Godzilla x Kong The New Empire in 2024. A sequel, Godzilla x Kong Supernova, is planned for release on the 26th of March 2027. King Kong is incredible, but it's also many other things that I can't not talk about in this episode. And it's not a particularly nice subject to talk about, but we need to talk about it because the racial subtext of King Kong is there. And it can be seen as racist propaganda, and it can also be enjoyed as spectacular entertainment. And both things can be true at once, and this is especially relevant to King Kong. You can't really escape from the accusations of blatant racism. King Kong premiered at a time when black men were regularly depicted as ape-like in popular culture. Racial exploitation movies were a thing. The 1930s was during the beginning of the Great Migration, when thousands of black Americans were leaving the southern states to move to the nation's biggest cities. The great economic crisis of the Depression led to mass unemployment and an exodus of population from southern states, states with large black populations, into cities where they were concentrated in ghettos. Fear of the economic crisis and fear of the black population fed each other in the white American imagination. King Kong was rooted in an explicitly racist period of American history and supported, at least implicitly, the cultural understanding shared widely by white Americans of the quote-unquote danger posed by African American men. The most widely discussed interpretation of King Kong is that it functions as a coded representation of black masculinity, specifically the white supremacist stereotype of the sexually threatening black man. Scholars draw a direct line from The Birth of a Nation, the 1915 film, about the supposed black male threat to white womanhood, coincidentally the film that helped resurrect the Ku Klux Klan, to King Kong in 1933. The Skull Island natives are depicted as primitive, superstitious, and racially distinct from the white, quote-unquote civilized men travelling to a remote island to extract something monstrous and bring it back to New York. It mirrors the logic of colonialism and the slave trade almost point for point. Whether Kong's death represents a symbol of black otherness, whose death restores white order, as some cultural critics have suggested, or a tragic look at the violent outcomes of a racist society, remains an open debate. Kong's death, shot down by white men from biplanes atop America's most iconic skyscraper, has been read as white men restoring white order after the threat of miscegenation. While King Kong is often compared to the story of Beauty and the Beast, many film scholars have argued that the film was a cautionary tale about interracial romance, even though literally all Anne does is scream and show fear towards Kong. While Cooper and Schoedsack insisted in contemporary interviews that there was no hidden meaning to King Kong, a posthumously published interview with Cooper revealed that his inspiration for the film was rooted in the image of a giant ape falling from the tallest building, which would represent how primitive people are doomed by modern civilization. Whether consciously or not, whether politically inspired or not, King Kong reinforced the racial status quo and preyed upon white fears of black Americans. And yet, despite the controversy surrounding it, it's also literally the eighth wonder of the world. The detail, the imagination, the visual splendour on screen. It's impressive still, now in 2026. Imagine what it must have felt like to see it in 1933. It's a singular piece of cinematic art. The score is incredible, it's entertaining, it's horrific, it's thrilling, and it's beautiful, and almost single-handedly created the blockbuster, despite not actually doing that, because as we all know, that was Jaws in 1975. But it's movie making at the height of what we expect movie making to be: artistry, craftsmanship, emotion, and richness of character. The level of detail in Kong himself just blows my mind, almost like they didn't have to go so hard on him, but he's so detailed and charismatic and at times frighteningly scary. His animalistic nature comes out and throws crew members to their death and stomps on people, and then in the small moments with Anne, he's playful and inquisitive. The attention to detail and technical brilliance is just astonishing. It's worth adding that I do really enjoy Peter Jackson's remake, and I actually saw that before I saw the original. But while Jackson's remake does a lot of things well, it just can't match this in terms of Kong. The CGI Kong looks great, photoreal, and acts like a real ape, but there's something about this Kong that's primeval. It's not slick. You see the finger marks in the fur, and you know a human has made this movie, and it just feels so tangible. I've always been in awe of the work of Ray Harryhausen and how he gave his creatures souls. He clearly learned it from the best, because there's something ageless about this Kong. Just thinking about how many movies, how many franchises owe a debt to King Kong, not least Godzilla, but also Jurassic Park, I'm sure those big gates were not an accidental homage. There's probably much I've missed in this episode as pertains to Kong's long-lasting legacy through cinema, video games, comics, books, theme park rides, musicals. 90 plus years of legacy is hard to summarise in one podcast episode by one podcaster. But in 1933, a giant ape climbed up the Empire State Building and forever became an iconic image in cinema history. at a time of Great Depression, at a time when fascism was gaining traction in Europe. King Kong was the escapism the public desperately needed. It may not have birthed kaiju movies, but it birthed the tragic monster movie and put the focus on man's hubris and the relationship humanity has with the natural world. Just like arrogance, greed and ignorance became Kong's untimely end, humanity is also at risk of the same things. And beauty will be the end of us all. Thank you for listening. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on King Kong, and thank you for your continued support of this podcast. Next episode, I'm going to give you a quote, and the quote is by Tomoyuki Tanaka. And he said, quote, "I felt like doing something big. That was my motivation. I thought of different ideas. I like monster movies, and I was influenced by King Kong," unquote. Tomoyuki Tanaka was the Japanese film producer best known for creating Godzilla. And of course, if I'm going to do King Kong, surely the logical next move is to talk about Godzilla from 1954. So please join me next episode for the history and legacy of Godzilla. Thank you for listening to Verbal Diorama, a totally free and independent podcast that relies on listener support. If you want to show your support in multiple different ways, you could leave a rating or review wherever you found this podcast. You could tell your friends and family about this podcast, or you could find me and follow me on social media and you can share the podcast that way. I am at Verbal Diorama across social media, where you can share posts, like posts, comment on posts. It all helps really to get the word out there, to hopefully get other people to know this podcast and know the recent episodes that I've put out. I genuinely love doing this podcast, and anything you could do to help would be so appreciated. A huge thank you to the incredibly generous patrons of this podcast. I could not do what I do without their support. To Simon, Laurel, Derek, Kat, Andy, Mike, Luke, Michael, Scott, Brendan, Ian, Lisa, Sam, Jack, Dave, Stuart, Nicholas, Zoe, Kev, Danny, Stu, Brett, Zenos, Sean, Rhino, Philip, Adam, Elaine, Aaron and Steve. Please consider joining them and supporting this podcast on Patreon if you have the means to. If you want to get in touch, you can email verbaldiorama@gmail.com. You can also go to verbaldiorama.com and you can fill out the contact form. You could say hello, you can give feedback, or you can give suggestions as well. I would genuinely love to hear from you. You can also DM me on social media as well, if that's an option available to you. I love to hear from people and I always try to respond as quickly as possible. Thanks again for listening, and thanks for supporting independent podcasting. It means more to us than you know. And finally,
Wait a minute. Let me through, officer. My name's Denham.
Just a moment. Oh, Lieutenant.
Lieutenant, I'm Carl Denham. Carl Denham?
Denham? Oh, that's the man that captured the monster.
Well, Denham, the airplane's got him. Oh, no. It wasn't the airplanes. It was beauty killed the beast.
bye.